I invite you to find a seat and get ready for the greatest show on earth. Actors, take your places. Everybody get your last cup of coffee. And John Krugler is going to take us on a trip to our church.
The story is by John Krugler. Steve Huttenberg did set design, and Jeff has done the set.
Our church. And what we are going to do today is take you through the first 25 years of Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church. So I want to extend our greetings from all of us here who have participated in this, the cooks and the servers, and above all the people who have cooperated with our play. Some of you may wonder, at least I hope you do, may wonder, how did this church get started? Now, if you were in the service, the second service, you heard a little bit about that. But what we want to do now is to fill in the story. How did this church come to be located in Wauwatosa? What were the forces that led to its founding? So what we're going to do today in 6 scenes is tell you about our church's history. 6 vignettes, if you will, about the church. Our church began, if you look back here, our church began on North Avenue in a storefront. And we rented quarters along North Avenue. We actually had to move because the proprietor of one shop threw the Presbyterians out. His wife was Catholic and she objected to having Presbyterians in their store. We then built a church at 9th and Windsor, which you see portrayed up there. So this was a wooden chapel, and it was located not too far from the city of Milwaukee. Tosa Presbyterians had to weather many a storm in those first years. The scenes you will see will highlight some of the important triumphs and tribulations experienced by members as they created a church. And that's what we're involved here, is the creation of a church. Wauwatosa Presbyterian, though, church was not just a building. It was a community of worshipers who came together and through their hard work produced a church. They helped, I suppose, they put together the church that we have become. So this is our story between 1926 and 1950. Now, I also want to tell you that I'm a professional historian, and I do have standards, but I put them aside. Because some of what you will see is made up out of whole cloth. Now, I would tell you that I believe that what I have written is true in the broadest sense of the word true, but much of the dialogue that you will see spoken and so forth did not appear in the historical record. Rather, it's more like a docudrama rather than a document. So please keep that in mind as you see what we have to offer. So sit back and enjoy our presentation of our church, the first generation.
Harry, welcome to the Mission Church on North Avenue. It's 1926.
We begin our story with Mrs. George Reich. Mrs. George Reich was a Presbyterian. She was married and the mother of 2 children in 1926 when they moved into Wauwatosa. We don't really have a person who's styled as our founder, but I think legitimately we could say Mrs. Reich was our founder, for she is the one who initiated the beginning of this church. So, Mrs. Reich, why don't you tell us a little bit about your story?
My husband and I recently moved here to Wauwatosa.
And we got shot.
Not good. But to our disappointment, there wasn't any Presbyterian churches. So my husband and I discussed our options. Rather, he said, why don't you go and discuss at the nearest presbytery your concerns? So I did just that, and I received a warm reception. The main man at the presbytery said, you know, why don't you canvass the area with this petition and see if there are others that want to join a Presbyterian church. So that's why I'm here today. Hopefully you'll agree with me and you'll sign this petition.
Don't be shy, folks. You can sign. Now, Mrs. Wright succeeded in her campaign. Presbytery was impressed with the results of her canvass of Wauwatosa and northwestern Milwaukee, and so they authorized the creation of a mission church. So we began as a mission church. The organizers moved quickly. They rented a storefront along North Avenue, and here on May 9th, 1926, they began Sunday school classes and worship services. Presbytery appointed 2 individuals to help the parishioners get organized. The Reverend Carl E. Franz was the executive presbyter, and Miss Clara Austin was a lay worker or a parish worker who assisted the Wauwatosa Presbyterians in getting organized. Reverend Franz served as the acting pastor, so he either preached in the storefronts or he got pulpit supply to provide a minister for doing that. Over the next year, between May and May, the little mission church grew by leaps and bounds. The storefronts could no longer house these Presbyterians. There were just too many of them. So with the assistance of Presbyterian representatives, Reverend Franz and parish worker Clara Austin, the enthusiastic Presbyterians looked to build a new church. Over a little more than a year after forming the mission church, they succeeded in putting up a building after they bought lots on 9th and Windsor, and they erected a chapel. Now you might associate what happened here with our church as something closer to something you might be familiar with, which would be a barn raising, where the neighbors come together, they build the sides, and then they simply put the building up, nail it together, put a roof on it, and they say, we're done. Now, what's amazing here is this was mostly the work of Presbyterian ministers who came together. So enthusiastic were they for building this church. So with donations and sweat equity, the new church was free of debt, and they were ready to start their worship services. Now, I bet some of you are wondering, where is 9th and Windsor? Does anybody know where 9th and Windsor is? Not the people in the cast, but you know. 9th and Windsor, it seems, was 67th and Garfield. And how did that change take place? In the 1930s, the county of Milwaukee wanted all of the suburbs to go on the same street grid as Milwaukee County. Wauwatosa, of course, not liking outside interference, resisted until there was a crisis where the fire trucks went to the wrong place, and they finally decided maybe we should do that. So, First Street was 76th Street. So as you then go to the east, you would go 75th, 74th, and so forth. And then Windsor's name was changed to Garfield. And so what we have is our church, our first church was built at 67th and Garfield, or 9th and Windsor.
Scene 2, moving to 9th in Windsor. Scene 2, it's still not early in 1927. We just moved a few months from when we first got together before.
The mission church grew very quickly. And what happened is that they prepared to move to the new church, even though they didn't have a minister, even though they weren't fully prepared. They decided to move into the new church in January of 1927. So the school children, along with a band, began a procession from the storefronts down here to the church, where the adults were waiting to greet them and enthusiastically waiting for the children. So, Maestro.
1, 2, 3.
This was January 16th, 1927, and it was a very cold day, but the greetings from the adults very much offset the cold weather outside. So the children then were prepared to move into the new church, as were the adults. And one woman remembered this occasion very fondly.
This is truly. This is truly a gala day for this small, enthusiastic group of Presbyterians.
Yay!
Now we move to scene 3, which is still in 1927. It's later in 1927 when Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church becomes incorporated.
With the Presbytery's encouragement and approval, church leaders prepared for the big event, the incorporation of Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church. The date was Friday, March 25th, 1927, which is just exactly 85 years from this date today. Even though they were Presbyterians, the atmosphere was charged with excitement as they anticipated what was going to come. Now you can see the elders, and note that they're all male elders. You see the elders in conversation among themselves. Where's Mrs. Wright? Now, of course, they were prepared to.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Wright. This is for men only.
Now, of course, Mrs. Wright would not have approached the ceremony for incorporation because she was a good Presbyterian woman and she knew her place in the church. The work being done here was the work of the males in the church. And Mrs. Wright would have known better than to push in on this ceremony. Now, what's interesting about our church founder, Mrs. George Reich, is that we don't know what her first name is. Because in the church records, she's always referred to as Mrs. George Reich. So, it was only through the later investigation of Ed Martinet that we found out that she did have a given name. It was Frances. So, Frances, thank you for all the work you did. Now, you may think, wow, this is pretty strange. But this was the 1920s. But this convention continued in the 1930s, and in the 1940s, and in the 1950s, and even into the 1960s. A woman who was married did not really have her own personhood. She was part of her husband's identity. So we see now at the church, the men are signing an important document that will organize and incorporate the church. We have representatives from Presbytery who are there because after all, we are a connectional church and it is through Presbytery that we get our official recognition. And now we will hear from our Presbytery representative.
Well, gentlemen, being newly charged with excitement and being a male, I am happy to say that everything here is in order. And so on behalf of the Presbytery of Milwaukee, I am here to hereby declare that Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church is now a member in good standing in this presbytery. Congratulations.
So it came to pass. Officials from the church and Presbytery gathered to sign the organization papers on that Friday evening. Those who were in attendance that evening became charter members of the church. Now, we don't know fully all of the people who joined the church because we were not good Presbyterians between 1926 and 1934. We didn't keep good records, or if they did, they disappeared. But the people who were there became the charter members, but others quickly joined in the church. One of the first things that the charter members did then was to elect their first church officers. And they were, of course, all men. Now, our church had been launched. One very important step was still to be completed, and that was what's missing? A minister. So we need to call a gospel minister. And that took place in 1927 as well.
So, who was going to lead our church? Between 1927 and 1930, the first pastor was Richard E. Evans and Miss Dixon. It's kind of hard to understand who was in charge of this team.
Wauwatosa Presbyterians had moved with decency and order, but I must confess they were moving at a sprinter's pace. They were moving right along. They canvassed, they organized it as a mission church, they started Sunday school classes and worship, they built a chapel, they secured their charter. Wow! These people wanted a church, didn't they? So, what's still lacking, though, was a permanent pastor. And in October of 1927, the elders brought candidates to the church to preach. One young man, still in seminary, made quite an impression. This was in October. He was called back weekend after weekend to preach. They liked what they heard, and so very quickly they moved, again perhaps with more dispatch and decency and order. They called a young man from Chicago who was in seminary. His name was Richard E. Evans. And in the blink of an eye, he became pastor of the Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church. I say in the blink of an eye because when they made the deal with him, he was supposed to wait until he finished seminary, graduated, and then was ordained in Chicago. Then he would come to Wauwatosa and begin his pastorate. But Richard Evans was a man of, well, he was impetuous. He didn't like to wait. So in November of 1927, we find him being styled as pastor of Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church. He didn't get ordained until June of 1928. So I don't know how that fits quite into what the calling of a minister is, but he wasn't perhaps fully endorsed until June of 1928. So along with him, accompanying him on his trips from Chicago was Miss Sarah E. Dixon. And Miss Dixon and Richard Evans would begin their ministry then in November of 1927. Richard Evans was only 29 years old, so our first pastor was only 29. Interestingly enough, he was born in Hamburg, Germany, and he'd been working in the meatpacking industry where his father was an executive when Miss Dixon came along and sort of pulled him out of that condition and convinced him that he was right for the Presbyterian ministry. So she gave up her home and moved into his house to care for his invalid relatives while he attended seminary. Mr. Evans was a young, competitive, talented, impetuous, and perhaps brash, but he was always on the move. He was a classic type A personality. Now, members of the little church loved their new team, their new pastor, and the woman who quickly became the director of Christian education and president of the Women's Guild. Now, I suppose I should say something about their relationship. As you can see, there was some age difference between them. Miss Dixon took this brash, untried young man and began to mold him into what she hoped would become a Presbyterian minister. So she took him under her tutelage. She recognized that he was a man of many talents, a diamond in the rough. And so you can think of these first years at Wauwatosa as Miss Dixon working to polish this very rough diamond. She did her best to keep his exuberance in check. And that reminds me of a story that one church member told about Mr. Evans and Miss Dixon. Did I mention that Mr. Evans was in perpetual motion? I think I did. This story takes place on a Saturday afternoon. Evans was supposed to marry a young woman in her home, and the ceremony was supposed to take place at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And she was just very determined that the ceremony would take place at 2 o'clock. Well, the family gathered in anticipation. You know what it's like at a wedding. It's a gala event. People gather. They're happy. Miss Dixon was there, but to the bride's great disappointment, Richard Evans wasn't there. So it was 1:45, and still no minister. Where was the minister? 2 o'clock, still no minister. 2:20, no minister. Finally, at 2:30, the disheveled pastor arrives.
Oh, Richard, where were you? This bride wanted to be married at 2 o'clock, and you weren't here, and you're very late. And look at how upset she is. She's so upset, Richard.
I'm sorry. I was helping the high school kids with their paper drive.
I wanted to be married at 2 o'clock.
I know how to fix that. Let's get this wedding started.
That was our first pastor. I told you he wasn't raised a Presbyterian, right? So, I mean, he was very competitive. He always wanted to be first. So we had the youngest male elder that was ordained in this country, Howell Pritchard, when he was 19 years old, became a ruling elder. That was a first for Evans. So he liked to be first, and it was part of his competitive personality that led to our church's participation in a momentous event in the history of the Presbyterian Church USA. So let me tell you one more story about our pastor and his mentor. This one involves our national church, PC USA. It's 1930, and the General Assembly is meeting in Cincinnati, Ohio. There are a number of overtures before the General Assembly, but the two most important ones were an overture that would allow for the ordination of women as gospel ministers. The second one was an overture that would allow women to be ordained as ruling elders. So these two were before General Assembly. Now the procedure is that they're sent out to the presbyteries, and the presbyteries vote, and then the vote is announced at General Assembly. So when the moderator got up and he talked about Overture A, he said, it failed to receive the requisite number of votes, therefore it does not pass. No women would be ordained as gospel ministers. Then he announced the second one, Overture B, had indeed passed, and women could now be ordained as ruling elders. So with that, our young pastor kicked it into high gear, if he's still here. So we're in Cincinnati, and it's just been announced that the overture has passed. But what we need to do is let Miss Dixon tell the story from here.
You know that I am Richard Evans' foster mother and his mentor in the Presbyterian Church. With my encouragement, he enrolled in the McCormick Seminary so he could become a Presbyterian pastor. We were both thrilled when he received a call from the little church in Wauwatosa. In 1930, we had been there already for 2 years. Under our leadership, under his as the pastor, and I was president of the Women's Guild and director of Christian education. So between us, the church grew at a fast pace. In June of that year, we were in Cincinnati for the General Assembly with a number of other Wauwatosa church members. As soon as that overture passed, that permitted churches to ordain women as ruling elders, Richard hurried to a telephone. He called an elder back in Wauwatosa at the church to set up a congregational meeting.
You might be a little surprised he didn't use his cell phone, but we're in 1930, folks. So the congregation was very receptive to following the lead of Richard Evans. A congregational meeting was called for that week so that the election could take place. The election took place and Miss Dixon was unanimously elected to be a ruling elder in the Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church. Now, as I said, Richard Evans was very competitive and he wanted to be first. So they put together an ordination ceremony that, again, probably was more hasty than done with decency and order. But still, they were able to bring in a number of dignitaries from the Presbytery and Miss Dixon's former pastor from Chicago. And they gathered at the little church on June 12, 1930, for the ordination ceremony.
So, Ms. Dixon, I have these questions for you. First of all, do you believe in one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit?
I do.
Do you accept the office of ruling elder in this church and promise faithfully to perform all the duties thereof in the grace of Jesus Christ?
I sure do.
Do you promise to study the peace, unity, and purity of the church?
I do.
Brothers and sister, in Christ, it is an honor for me to join you, all of you, on this historic occasion. I bring greetings from your sister presbytery, the Presbytery of Chicago, which sent to you both the founding pastor of this church, Richard Evans, and the first woman elder in our history, Miss Sarah E. Dixon. My charge, therefore, to Miss Dixon, we'll soon learn to call you Ms. Dixon, this church, and to all Christians, is this: don't stop. Do not rest on your laurels. Do not stop until all people, female and male, young and old, rich and poor, hear Christ calling and say yes to following him. Do not stop, but take always the next step.
So it came to pass. Miss Dixon became the first ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church USA. It happened at that little chapel on 67th and Garfield, and the date was June 12, 1930. This, of course, is a glorious occasion for Christ's church, so we ought to rejoice and be glad in it. But it wasn't the end, it was merely the beginning. Her ordination was merely one step along a long journey for equality for women. The next step would be the ordination of women as gospel ministers, pastors. And I said it didn't happen in 1930, and it didn't happen in 1940, and it didn't happen in 1950, but it did happen in 1954. So 24 years after women were granted the right to be ordained as elders, they were now granted the privilege of being gospel ministers. Now don't get me wrong, eldership is a very important ministry, and our church had taken one giant step for womankind. But back to the 1930s, Miss Dixon's ordination was a crowning moment in our church's history, and it was a crowning moment in the Dixon-Evans team. Now I might add, just to keep the record straight, that the Wauwatosa Presbyterians didn't want to rush into anything too dramatic, and so they waited 31 years before they ordained another woman, 1961.
So the next scene will be scene 5. Scene 5 will be, how does a church grow in the Great Depression, the 1930s?
Mr. Evans and Miss Dixon left in at the end of 1933, and pastors came and went. Reverend Donald Morrison, who succeeded Evans, was a Presbyterian. And I am grateful to him because he started keeping records, which is nice for a historian. And then there were others. The Reverend John Rowland came in 1947. Before him was the Reverend Everett Delaware. So we had a succession of ministers. We weathered many a storm, but there was no greater storm that faced this church than the Great Depression. The Great Depression had cut deeply into everyone's lives, and so the economy in the 1930s could not have been worse, but our church continued to grow. The Depression didn't stop it from growing. One church activity revolved around our stalwart church women, members of the Women's Guild. They continued the effort to see that the church had enough funds to conduct its business. So just as in 1930s fundraising is important, so too is it in our present century.
Yes, the Great Depression was tough, but our little church grew. We added a Sunday school wing in 1928 and a kitchen in 1932. It seems like we women in the guild were always baking. We cooked the meals at home and take them to the church for our bake sales. Did you know that the Women's Guild raised more than $3,500 to build the brick manse?
That was Mrs. Floss Wetzel, Frank Wetzel, wife. Mrs. Wetzel is the woman for whom we've named our archives because she was such a great pack rat. She saved everything. And so much of what we have about the church's early history comes from Floss. So not only was she a talented cook, but she also was a great collector. But the people in the church at that time loved their church, and they were willing to fight through the economic turmoil of the 1930s. We have a budget in our archives from 1934. The total budget of the church in 1934, the asked-for budget, was $3,260. $3,260. Now the biggest chunk went to the minister's salary. The minister at that time in 1934 was paid $1,800. Another $500 was, dedicated to buildings and grounds, gas and water and those kinds of things. A few dollars was set aside for repairs and so forth. We have records from Howell Pritchard from the 1930s of what individual people came. He was the treasurer and he kept them. And it's amazing. People were giving 15 cents, 20 cents a week because that's all they could afford. But it still was important. They continued to give. So these were hard times for Wauwatosa Presbyterian, but people gave everything they could to keep the church going.
Next, we'll move on to Scene 6. Scene 6 takes place between 1948 and 1950 when the Reverend John Rowland was brought to build the new church.
Well, I guess you get the point. Our church community continued to grow under the leadership of first Donald Morrison and then under Everett Delaware. They weathered World War II, which was a very hard time for the church. The little chapel, though, was bursting at its seams. After Delaware left in 1947, our church faced a crossroads. To build or not to build? That was the question. For the first time in our church's history, and I think the only time in our church's history, the church split into two serious factions. One wanted to build and build immediately. The other said, wait, let's be a little more cautious. So the congregation voted. The congregation voted to call a building pastor, the Reverend John Rowland. Reverend Rowland.
They call me Rev John.
Rev!
Get the song.
I get things done. Maybe it's fixing a roof. It's fixing some bad plumbing. But this congregation called me to build a new church. There's an old saying, maybe you've heard it. Time waits for no minister. So let's go. Let's get on it. Let's get this ship going. We need to organize a fundraising campaign. Hire an architect. Find some property.
Now wait just a minute here. There are some of us here who think you're moving too fast. After all, we're Presbyterians. We need to make this move with decency and order.
Yes. Yes, just think about how well this chapel has served us. We have so much history here. We need to be more cautious.
This congregation called me to build a church. And build it I shall.
Now wait a minute. Wait a minute. This is really important. We need to take this to the presbytery.
And so they did. Presbytery heard their complaints, they took them seriously, and it appointed 3 ministers to investigate the charges against the Reverend John Rowland. And we're very fortunate we have one of those ministers here with us today, the Reverend Carl Simon, who was on that panel who investigated John Rowland, and he also became our Presbytery's first executive presbyter. So we're very glad to have you with us, Carl. Now what we find is the congregation began to split. Those who supported Rowland stayed with him, and those who were against him began to move to another side. Presbytery came in and investigated the charges to see whether Mr. Rowland had violated any of the tenets of being a good Presbyterian minister. These investigations do take some time. After a few weeks, the committee reported to Presbytery, and the committee fully vindicated the Reverend John Rowland.
Members of the Wauwatosa Presbyterian Church, I've been pleased to be here on a couple of previous occasions, which were much happier than this one. But at the same time, I affirm here that the Presbytery of Milwaukee has, as you now can see through this transparency, the Presbytery has investigated the issues that have been brought forward and finds that the Reverend Mr. Rowland has acted properly in all matter whatsoever. Thank you very much. I am vindicated.
So Mr. Rowland had been vindicated, but what he did, which is a little surprising, he asked all of those who had not supported him in this cause to find a new church home. And so many
I have a
people,
message for all of you who disagreed with me. I invite you to find a new church home.
so many members of the church left and went to Perseverance and other Presbyterian churches. The families who left had been among the founders of the church, and so this was a serious rift in the church. But like all churches, they were able to survive this serious splintering, and so it came to pass that the differences were put aside, and under Rowland's leadership, the church began to move towards building a new church. They purchased lots on 80th Street. Unbeknownst to them, they purchased a lot right on top of a spring, but that would only be found out later. The fundraisers went to work, and the chapel, which had served them so well, was sold, and they moved into temporary quarters at the Knights of Pythias building. Marge Hildebrand remembered as a child, she went there with her parents on Sunday morning early to clean up, and they couldn't quite get rid of all the cigar smoke and beer odor that was left over from the celebrating nights the night before. So in 1950, with 400 members, the congregation dedicated its new church on 80th Street. this ends our story of the first generation. We have, I think, survived the trials and tribulations in so many ways. We've tried to give you a glimpse of our church's first 25 years as part of the 85th anniversary celebration. And so I think it's only appropriate that as we end this, we give our current pastor, the Reverend James Rand, the last word. So, Reverend Rand, if you would come forward, please.
When you say the last word, you mean words, right?
Words, yes.
We are celebrating a great and wonderful day for the church, and I am so grateful to John Krugler for leading the events. There's no one here that knows more about our history and who can make it up where he doesn't know what it is. Not only has he been the narrator for this afternoon, but he was the liturgist at both services and the author of the play, as you know. We Presbyterians love to eat. Have you noticed that? So special thanks goes to the committee that planned the meal. That includes Ann Cowling. If you're out here and where you can wave your hand or stand up, that'd be great. Ann Cowling, Donna Crump, the indispensable Virginia Doherty, Jay Garby, and the lovely and talented Sarah Rand, along with Julie Batsion, who did not only help with the meal, but also the beautiful decoration. I also want to thank Laura Loving and Denise Freed for helping to edit the play, to recruit actors, and oversee the big picture of all that's happened today. Behind-the-scenes creators include Stephen Hudson Merritt, up for an Oscar for Best Stage Design, Jeff Homar for Grip and Gap and Best Boy, what is it? All those fine print at the end of the movie credits. Don Weinberg for Best Original Score. Ed Steck for Lights, Sound, and 3D Special Effects, so real you don't even need glasses. Musicians Dave Palmer, Brian Lucart, Bob Crick, and Bill Humphreys. Let's have rounds of applause. When we mention the musicians, I heard just at the table today, those musicians that we have on a permanent basis added up their years here at Wauwatosa and came to exactly 100. So let's give a round of applause to all those people. I may be missing some folks. I know the cast of thousands was revolving a little bit, but nominees for Best Actor or Actress include Heather Lee Milius, Jeff Homar, Nancy Moon. Was Nancy here after all? I'm not sure she made it. And Joni Weinberg. Nominees for Best Child Actor or Actress, stand up and take a bow. Claire and Bridget Flanders, Emma Hudson Merritt, Grace Hudson Merritt, Mitchell Weinberg Kinsey. Who else did I miss? Oh, okay, thanks. All right, there are some others that were part of the parade. And we'll give a shout out to Kate Pluta, who is with her mother, I think en route to Shanghai right now. Best supporting actors include Bill O'Loughlin, Ed Martinet, Dave Palmer, Denny Bachelet, Richard Ainsworth, many of them here. Best cameo appearance, Bill Humphreys. Most realistic portrayal, Liam McMahon. Best actress married to the author of the play, Dee Krugler. Most disappointed bride, Nora Whetter. Most likely to make it in Hollywood, that is, make it spaghetti in Hollywood, Carrie Strife-Stussy. Least likely to be confused with the... we've done that, but going back 16 years, we weren't even sure we could raise $75,000 to put in an elevator. We've done that, we've done the parking lot, we've done the roof, we've done a shed. We have done a host of other improvements to this building. And I really think it is a beautiful, hospitable place. Everybody that comes in for the first time says so. Shirley, you hadn't seen it for years and years, and her first words to me were, "This church looks great." So thank you. What's more, we've got people that made building fund pledges, more than 50 that have agreed to switch those over into the regular giving accounts, the operating fund, and so we say thank you to them. And the second to last thing I want to do today is celebrate the burning of the mortgage. I saw Judson here just a minute ago. Did he slip out? I hope not. Is Judson still here? He's probably gone to the little boy. Okay, you go find him and I'll keep talking. And Liam, come up and dance with me. I want to thank all of you for being the church, proud yet humble, reflective but active, committed but not dogmatic, doing everything we can, but knowing all our efforts depend finally on Jesus Christ, or they not. So, we have shown God's ability to do far more than we ask or expect, and our own ability to do amazing things in God's name. We are blessed people. Give yourselves a hand. Judson is the chair of our finance committee, and I wanted him here to light the match. I didn't give him advance warning, but if we can get him to light the match that will burn some of our mortgage papers, photocopies, not the real ones, we will do that in just a moment. And the fire extinguisher is nearby. While we're hoping that Judson can make it back in, I've asked a bunch of people to share in our closing prayer, so if we could get all of them to come up to the stage. And Laura, wherever you are, I still have your copy of that. There comes the man representing the Finance Committee, without whom we could not have done this. He and the committee are the ones that suggested to me, you know, I think we've got enough money in the bank that we could pay this thing off. And sure enough, they've done it. So there's the man. I trust him.
Save it for Ash Wednesday.
That's an idea. Okay. Let's join in our closing prayer, and I trust all of you are more or less in the right order and can follow along. Let's pray. We are a remembering people, O God, and we remember that you chose us, baptized us, and brought us together as the church in this place. We remember, too, all the saving acts through time, the creation, the flood, the blessing of Abraham and Sarah and their offspring, the Exodus, the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ.
We are a remembering people, but also people of this day, called by Christ and empowered by the Spirit for sharing, caring, working in the world, and living in the hope of the world to come.
Our eyes look back with thanksgiving and forward in hope. Therefore, with thanksgiving for the past and hope for the future, let us dedicate ourselves and our lives to the mission God gives us as the church.
Help us live faithfully in the present. Empower us with your Spirit, O Lord, to proclaim your good news.
Enable us to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with you all our days.
Never weary, O God, of showing us ways to love one another and the stranger among us.
Equip us to care for the needy, support the weak,
listen to those long silenced, and to heal broken relationships.
Break down prejudices and barriers that divide Christian from Christian, old and young, rich and poor. Make us all one in Jesus Christ.
Renew us by the Spirit to move out of our ruts, our apathy, and our anxieties of inadequacy.
Grant that we may attain the priesthood of all believers, so that we may carry out our mission of service and love.
Bring us at last to the joy of your eternal kingdom, with the faithful of this church who have gone before us, and with all your saints, so that we may praise your name forever.
Use us as you will, loving God, to the glory of your name and the welfare of your people. Through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
We are remembering people, O God. May our remembering lead to doing, and our doing to remembering, with praise and thanks always to you. And let all the people say, Amen. Go in peace. Thank you so much for being this church.